Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of The National Interest, and it's my pleasure today to introduce John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago for many years, and I believe one of the most popular lecturers with the students, at least if Robert Kaplan's portrait of John in The Atlantic, I think about a year ago, is accurate. And that portrait was interesting because it, I think, provided a fuller portrait of John than some of his detractors have been presenting for a number of years, since he and Stephen Walt co-wrote a book on the Israel lobby in the United States. John's written a number of other books on American grand strategy, and we were pleased to feature in the latest issue of The National Interest his very lengthy and detailed article on American foreign policy, centering on Syria and Egypt, and then concluding with a discussion of the national security state that has emerged in America, including the activities of the NSA. And John sewed it up all very nicely, pointing to the steady expansion of what amounts to federal national security power, both abroad and at home, and questioning whether this is appropriate or whether it is in fact inimical to traditional American values. And by a lucky chance this morning, we actually have John here, because I got a somewhat disconsolate email this morning at about 8:12 when I checked my iPhone. And John had indicated that he would not be able to make it to Washington, D.C., because his flight in Montreal had been canceled due to mechanical difficulties. Then he just provided further illumination, saying that he had rebooked his flight. He couldn't get on the rebooked flight. Then as he's walking down the hall, he hears that the original flight to Washington is taking place after all. He rebooks for a second time and is one of 3 people to arrive on that flight here in Washington, D.C. So he sent me an email calling it a miracle, which I thought was somewhat euphoric language coming from a professed realist. But we are indeed very fortunate to have John, and I will hand it over to him. He will speak for about, I believe, 15 to 20 minutes, and then we should have a lively discussion about American foreign policy with John Mearsheimer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. I'd like to thank Jacob for inviting me today and for running the piece in the magazine, and also thanking Dimitri for his support over the years. And thank all of you for coming out here. It is something of a miracle that I'm here. The piece is long, so there's no way I can go into it in great detail, and I'll just lay out the basic argument or arguments and hit the highlights, and then we can elaborate on whatever you want to talk about in the Q&A. I think it's clear that, since early 2011, when serious trouble started both in Egypt and Syria, the United States has been deeply concerned about what's going on in those 2 countries. And indeed, earlier in August of 2013, the United States actually thought about using military force in Syria. And as I said in the piece, I think there are sort of 3 key strands of our thinking here in Washington about those 2 countries. One is that what happens in Syria and in Egypt is of vital importance to the United States. These are sort of core strategic areas. Second, there's a very powerful moral case, at least in the case of Syria, for military intervention. And third, I think it's widely believed here in Washington, at least it has been for the past 15 years, that the United States has the ability to remedy the problems in these countries. We believe, I think, as a society that we're really good at fixing problems in countries around the world. And I think if you think about the Syria and Egypt cases, it becomes clear very quickly that thinking about Syria and Egypt is part of a bigger picture. And there are two dimensions to that bigger picture. One is that the United States basically believes, and here I'm talking mainly about the foreign policy elites in Washington, places like New York, that every nook and cranny of the world is of great strategic importance to the United States. There's just no place out there that really doesn't matter to us. And we therefore feel compelled to stick our nose in virtually everybody's business. Second belief is that we live in very dangerous times. This is reflected in the two cites that I gave, one by General Dempsey, who said in February of 2012 that we are living in the most dangerous times in my lifetime right now. And Dempsey, according to Wikipedia, was born in the early 1950s, so his lifetime includes the Cuban Missile Crisis, the various Berlin crises, and the Cold War more generally. And then there's Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who was born in 1934, and as you all know, Adolf Hitler took power in Germany on January 30th, 1933. Senator Inhofe said in March 2013, "I don't remember a time in my life where the world has been more dangerous and the threats more diverse." Now, let me lay out my views on these particular set of arguments, and I'll take them in reverse order. First of all, the claim that we live in an insecure world is not a serious argument. We are the most secure great power in the history of the world, and we are more secure now than we have been at any time in our history. The best way to illustrate this is by talking about isolationism in the 1930s and early 1950s. Franklin D. Roosevelt had an enormously difficult time defeating the isolationists. And the reason he had an enormously difficult time defeating the isolationists is because the isolationist case is so powerful. It's not politically correct to say that in the United States today, but it's true. It wasn't that Roosevelt was up against a bunch of lunatics who had crazy ideas. He was up against very smart people who had a very powerful argument. I believe the isolationists were ultimately wrong, but nevertheless, you do not want to underestimate the power of that argument. The isolationist case was built around the claim that we had two giant moats that separated us from the rest of the world, and therefore nobody could get at us. That argument was being made at a time when Imperial Japan was on a rampage in Europe, and Nazi Germany was on a rampage in Europe. Isolationists could not be defeated by Roosevelt. It took Pearl Harbor to defeat the isolationists. Well, today, those two giant moats remain intact. We have thousands of nuclear weapons, the ultimate deterrent. Virtually everybody in my business believes if you have nuclear weapons, nobody is going to invade you. And furthermore, the vast majority of people inside the Beltway believe we live in a unipolar world. By definition, that means there's one power on the planet. That one power is us. Furthermore, in the Western Hemisphere, we are a regional hegemon. There's not a single country in this hemisphere, in our neighborhood, that would give us any trouble. Please explain to me how a country that's separated from Europe and Asia by two giant moats, that has thousands of nuclear weapons, is the only great power on the planet, and is a regional hegemon, is insecure. We are not insecure. General Dempsey's comment that we are living in the most dangerous times in his lifetime is not a serious argument. I lived during the Cold War. It was much more dangerous. The Cuban Missile Crisis is much more dangerous than anything we have today. The Soviet Union was a formidable adversary. We have no formidable adversary. We live in a unipolar world. Who is out there who's so threatening? And Senator Inhofe, you just sort of find it hard to fathom what he's talking about. He was born in 1934. From 1934 to 1945 is 11 years. During those 11 years, Adolf Hitler was alive. Nazi Germany was intact. And he's telling us that the world is more dangerous today? Please tell me who's out there. And of course, the argument is terrorism. Terrorism is a minor threat. It's just not that serious a threat. Yes, we got hit on September 11th. Yes, that was tragic. That was not a devastating attack. And if you look at what's happened since, it's hard to see what's out there that we're so scared about. Is there some possibility that we'll get hit again? Yes. But that is not the equivalence of going one-on-one with the Soviet Union or going one-on-one with Nazi Germany. There's no great power out there. They're a bunch of terrorists who really can't get at us. And if they can get at us, they can't do that much to us. And the idea that they're going to get nuclear weapons and we're going to be hit with a handful of nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future, in my opinion, is not a serious argument. So what are we worried about? The shoe bomber? I don't go to bed at night worrying about the shoe bomber, the underwear bomber. I mean, who's out there? Just hard to see. So we do have to worry about the world. And as many of you know, I believe that there is a security competition coming up, and it's going to be with China, and it is going to be really serious. I'm not an isolationist, right? I'm in favor of the pivot to Asia, and I'm in favor of containing China. But excuse me, today there is no great threat that justifies the kind of rhetoric that you hear from people like General Dempsey and the senator from Oklahoma. Now, what about Syria and Egypt? Just at a general level, these are countries that have hardly any gross national product and have feeble militaries. The Israelis have gone up against the Egyptians in 48, 56, 67, and 73. They cleaned their clocks. In 73, they got caught with their pants down in one of the great surprise attacks of all time. The Israelis recovered, and we had to rein them in before they ended up in Cairo. The Syrians have gone up against the Israelis on a number of occasions, 48, 67, 73. They lost every time. Unlike the Egyptians, they don't have peaceful relations with the Israelis, and anytime there's a potential conflict between the Syrians and the Israelis, the Syrians are backstepping to avoid conflict, and they're moving faster than the best cornerbacks in the NFL when they backstep. They don't want to fight with the IDF. In fact, the IDF is reducing its conventional forces because its conventional force advantage over Egypt and Syria is so great. So why are these countries serious threats to us? Why are we worried about them? Well, you have to make, special arguments. Just to take a couple of them, with regard to Syria, one argument is that we really should care about Syria because of Iran. This is a wonderful opportunity to slam Iran. Iran's well on its way to becoming a hegemon, and it's going to dominate the Middle East, and if we don't do something about that, we're going to be in real trouble. And an opportunity for us is presented in Syria because, of course, the Iranians are supporting the Syrians. Iran is not on the verge of becoming a potential hegemon in the region, even if it gets nuclear weapons. We're simply not going to allow that to happen. Furthermore, if we were to whack Iran really badly in Syria, which I don't think is going to happen, because if we up the ante, the Iranians and the Russians and Hezbollah will up the ante. But let's assume that doesn't happen, and let's assume that we're able to topple Assad and deal something of a blow to Iran. First of all, it's not going to have much effect on the Iranian balance of power in the region. But furthermore, if you really scare Iran and you make it look weak, then it's more likely, not less likely, to get nuclear weapons. So anytime you think about dealing a blow to Iran, you want to remember that if anything, that gives it an incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. Then is the argument that we have to deal with we have to deal with Syria because it's become a hotbed of terrorism. And it's now one of the core areas of the world that we have to worry about on that front. The fact is, until we decided to help topple Assad from power, Syria was helping us in the war on terror. This disgusting practice that we had of sending people we captured to countries where they could be tortured included Syria. Syria is one of the places we were sending people. They were willing to torture people for us, number one. And number two, they were providing intelligence for us that helped us deal with al-Qaeda. There are at least 2 documented cases where there were potential attacks against the United States that the Syrians helped us with. The fact is that all countries in the Middle East don't like terrorists that they can't control because they get them into a lot of trouble. This is what happened to Saddam Hussein. If we hadn't been hit on September 11th, I believe Saddam Hussein would still be in power. Syria has no interest in seeing al-Qaeda strike the United States again for fear it will be next on the target list. So Syria was willing to cooperate with us in the war on terror. Yes, it has now become a hotbed of terrorism, but that's because of our policies. Then there's the argument that our credibility or our reputation is at stake. And this has to do with the fact that Barack Obama drew a red line in Syria, and he said that if chemical weapons were used, that would be sufficient cause for the United States to get involved militarily. First of all, he was foolish to say that, and many people in the White House knew that at the time. He should have never drawn that red line in the sand. But also, just on the whole subject of credibility, we have a lot of data now that shows, from looking at the Cold War and other crises, that credibility doesn't accumulate across crises, as many people here in Washington believe. And in fact, it's context dependent. I'm old enough to remember when we lost in Vietnam. When we lost in Vietnam, there were some people who believed in the domino theory who said that that would result in loss of American credibility all over the globe. That did not happen at all. And it's because, again, credibility is context dependent. So even if Barack Obama failed to deliver on his promise to use military force in the case of Syria, I don't think it would have damaged our credibility with regard to our Asian allies or our European allies. So I don't think there's a strategic case to be made for worrying about what happens in Syria or in Egypt. And I certainly don't think there's a strategic case to be made for expending American blood and iron. And if people think otherwise, I'd be curious to hear what they have to say. And of course, as you know, it's not just a strategic argument that's put out on the table. There's also a moral argument that's made. This is the argument that we have a moral responsibility to shut down civil wars like the one that's taking place in Syria. I would be in favor in certain cases of intervening in moral wars to prevent genocide. I was in favor of intervening in Rwanda in 1994. So in circumstances like that, I'd be willing to countenance it. But what's happening in Syria is not genocide. It's deeply regrettable, and I don't want to make light of it for 1 second. But I don't see it as necessary for the United States to intervene to stop the killing. I believe in self-determination. I believe that people around the globe should figure out for themselves what kind of political system they want to live in, and they should be pretty much free to do what they want. We had a civil war in this country between 1861 and 1865. The British thought about intervening. They didn't. I think that's a good thing. We all would recoil if people from foreign countries were to interfere in our conflicts. We believe in self-determination. I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we should promote self-determination all around the globe. Let the Syrians and the Egyptians figure out what's best for them. And that's especially important because, again, we have no strategic interests in those countries. Then there's, of course, the argument that we should care greatly because chemical weapons were used. I don't understand this weapon at all. I mean, this argument at all. I wrote a book on B.H. Liddell Hart, who was on the Somme, the first great British battle of World War I. He went over the top the third week, and he was gassed by the Germans. After the war, he became a big proponent of the argument that chemical warfare or gas warfare was a more humane form of warfare than shrapnel and bombs, because he saw what all those shrapnel and bombs did to all the boys who climbed out of the trenches and tried to cross no man's land with German machine guns and artillery on the other side. He said, I'll take the gas any day. I'm not making the case for gas warfare, but the idea that getting killed by gas is more horrible than getting ripped apart by shrapnel and bullets is not one I buy. And when I see the Obama administration putting pictures of people killed by gas up on the internet, I say, let's put pictures of the people who got killed by shrapnel up there and have a debate about which pictures look worse. It won't even be an interesting debate. Getting killed by shrapnel is, in my opinion, a lot more gruesome and a lot worse. But regardless, Furthermore, there's the whole argument that the administration made that so many people were killed by chemical weapons. Their number was around 1,400 plus. I think the actual number was less, but let's assume it was 1,400. The fact of the matter is that over 40,000 other people were killed with bombs and bullets before those 1,400 people. If 40,000 people were killed and that didn't provide a moral justification for intervention, what's the moral justification for killing people with 1,400 when 1,400 died with chemical weapons? I don't get it. In fact, I don't think there's a moral case to be made for intervention. Again, I want to emphasize that I think what is happening there is horrible, and I'm not justifying it in any way. But the question of whether we should intervene for moral reasons is not one I buy. And this brings me to my third point about these cases. If you're going to do it for moral reasons, you have to believe that you can go in and make the problem better. Who at this point in time believes the United States can go anywhere and make anything better? Right? Afghanistan? Iraq? 0 for 2. I entered the American military in 1965. I was in the American military from 65 to 75, which is coterminous with the Vietnam War. I thought I'd never see another case where the United States went into a stupid war and lost in a similar fashion, right? Well, we've done 2 of them, right? We lost in Iraq, and we're in the process of losing in Afghanistan. I mean, I understand that spinmeisters down here can define these as great victories, but I don't know who really believes that, who's thought seriously about these things. And then there's Libya. We made a mess of that place, right? Then there's Egypt and Syria. Look at the consequences of our interference in both those cases. If you ask me, it's 0 for 5. Where's the case where we've done a lot of good since September 11th in our foreign policy? If you ask me, we have the Midas touch in reverse. So the idea that we're going to go in there and do moral good, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. And of course, if you listen to John Kerry talk about how much military force we were actually going to use in August of last year, he was talking about using a really tiny, tiny amount of military force, and he basically said it's not going to do us any good or do them any good, and we're not going to end up toppling Assad from power. You just sort of scratch your head and say, what's the point of all this? You know, this is a powerful moral argument, not in the world I operate in. So that's my argument against it. Then we get to the question of what are the costs? Now, one might think that I believe that there are great strategic costs here. I believe a lot of people think that. I think a lot of people think that the United States is in decline because we lost in Iraq and we're going to lose in Afghanistan. This is the same kind of logic that you had during the Vietnam War. When we finally lost in Vietnam, a lot of people thought that was the end. The United States was in decline, ... As you all know, 14 years later, we emerged, right, as the greatest power on the planet when the Soviet Union collapsed. It collapsed, not us, because power is largely a function of GNP. And what happens in Iraq and Afghanistan has virtually no effect on our power position in the world, any more than losing in Vietnam had any effect on our power position in the world. Again, look at what happened 14 years later, right? So the fact is that we can run around the world doing all sorts of foolish things, and we do not pay a significant strategic price. Yes, we do have a terrorism problem as a result of our policies. It's very important to understand that. Our foreign policy is the principal reason that we have a terrorism problem. They don't hate us because of who we are. They hate us because of our policies. The survey data and the anecdotal data on this is overwhelming. They hate us because of our policies. You would then say to yourself, well, why don't we change our policies and do away with the terrorism problem? It's because the terrorism problem is not that big a problem. In fact, it provides lots of jobs for people, right? It allows us to maintain this huge national security establishment that's constantly running all over the planet, picking fights with everybody who doesn't do business our way, right? So there are no real strategic costs here, right? And again, that's why this is allowed to go on. The costs, in my opinion, are number one, economic, number two, human, and number three, in terms of what it does to our liberal democratic fabric. And I mean liberal democratic in the general sense of the term, not in the Democratic Party versus Republican Party sense of the term. Huge economic costs here. these two wars alone probably cost somewhere between $4 to $6 trillion. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we spend enormous amounts on defense against whom? Who's the threat out there? Soviet Union? No. Nazi Germany? No. Imperial Japan? No. China? Not yet. Who's out there? Who are we spending all this money against? And we have a lot of economic problems. We have a huge debt. And then there's the whole opportunity costs argument. I ran into a high-level guy in the Obama administration who spends lots of time going to Asia. He was telling me, he said, when I was young and I first got into this business, and I used to go from American airports to airports in Asia, it was like going from the first world to the third world. He said, now when I go from American airports like LaGuardia and LAX to airports in Asia, it's like going from the third world to the first world. We don't invest much money in infrastructure anymore. Come out to Chicago if you have any doubts about that. It's not quite the problem here in Washington that it is in other places around the country, because you're here in Washington where the money bags are. But come out to Chicago sometime. Come and see our public schools. You think this is good? You think it's good that we're spending all this money fighting wars in places that really don't matter, creating a terrorist problem? When we could be spending that money on scientific research and assorted other things? I don't think so. So I think there are real economic costs here. Then there are the human costs. First of all, we're asking people to go out and fight in wars that are lost causes. What I find really disturbing is somebody who spent a lot of time in the American military during the Vietnam War, is that most Americans would not fight that war if they were forced to. We would not be fighting these wars if we had a draft. It's the fact that we don't have a draft, and we have a handful of people who were able to convince that they're doing God's work or doing the country's work in fighting these crazy wars, that gets them to do it year after year. Right? They pay an enormous price, and the elite in this country is paying hardly any price at all. And I find that very bothersome. And again, it reminds me a lot of Vietnam. But the survey data is very clear on here that most people just don't think these wars are worth fighting, and quite correctly so. That's my point. Iraq was an unnecessary war. So I think there's significant human costs. And again, it doesn't involve a large slice of the society. It involves a small slice of the society. But there's something really wrong about that, in my humble opinion. This brings me to my final set of points, and that has to do with the effect that our policies have on the liberal democratic fabric, which is what, in my opinion, makes this country so great. I've spent a lot of time, I've been teaching at the University of Chicago for 32 years, and I spent a lot of time in graduate school before that, and I spent a lot of time in the military. I went to West Point as an undergraduate, so I know that institution very well. There's no way you could have a powerful national security state that's traipsing all over the world, fighting wars all the time, and not do serious damage to the liberal democratic fabric. The Founding Fathers understood this completely. These men were not fools. They were very smart guys. They understood exactly what they were talking about. The United States has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. 2 out of every 3 years. We have fought 6 wars, and we still have people talking about bashing Iran or bashing Syria. There's no end in sight, right? This is going to have an effect, and it's going to have an effect in just all sorts of ways. And what you're getting now with the NSA is, in my opinion, just the start of this problem. If you're going around the world helping to foster a terrorism problem, you're going to create very powerful incentives for the state or the government to monitor everybody's business, to find out who are the terrorists and who the terrorists are cavorting with. It's perfectly understandable why the NSA wants to do that. In fact, we know from the literature on the state that even if you don't have a terrorist threat, states are deeply concerned about keeping track of everybody, assembling all sorts of information on people. It's why they have social security numbers and censuses and so forth and so on. The state is an institution that's constantly looking around trying to accumulate data on its citizens. This is what the Founding Fathers understood. And this is why the Founding Fathers went to enormous lengths to establish a state, right, that had limited power. Well, if you're going to have a national security state, you're going to be involved all over the planet. The end result is it's going to be, you're quickly going to be in a situation where you are violating civil liberties. And I am a big civil libertarian. I do not like the idea of the government listening to my phone calls or reading my email. And I think that's only the start. It'll just get worse over time. So my bottom line here is that what we have is we have a situation where the United States is more secure than it has ever been in its history. And this is a country that has been remarkably secure from the beginning. And it is more secure now. Yet nevertheless, it is running around the globe acting as if there were threats everywhere. And the end result of this is that there are significant economic, human, and civil liberty costs to the United States. And I think for that reason, it's time that we changed our policy in fundamental ways and became much less interventionist and much less interested in dominating the globe.
Well, John, thank you for that unflinching talk and piercing insights.